Welcome to the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. Each week, government executives and thought leaders join me for an informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government and its effectiveness. These individuals are truly changing the way government does business. What is the mission of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, and how is it working to meet the requirements of its permanent authorization? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Rupa Bhattacharyya, Special Master of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. My co-host from IBM is Don Finhagen. Take a look and take a listen. Download the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, and at businessofgovernment.org. So, Rupa, would you give us an overview of the history and mission of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund? How has it evolved since its inception?
The VCF was originally created in 2001, immediately following the attacks. It was created as an alternative to tort litigation so that these matters wouldn't have to be resolved in the courts, and was designed to provide compensation for any individual or the personal representatives of those who were killed, who suffered physical harm or who were killed in the attacks, in the buildings, on the airplanes, or who responded within the first very short time period, about 72 hours. So it was very, very limited in scope. That VCF, which we call VCF-1, operated from 2001 to 2004 under the director of Special Master Ken Feinberg. And it closed in 2004 after having distributed $7 billion to over 5,000 people who were immediately affected by the attacks. By 2011, it had become very clear that the effects of the attacks and the exposure to the toxins that were present at all three of the crash sites were having lingering health effects for responders, for people who participated in cleanup, and even for people who were just living or working or going to school in the area. And so in 2011, Congress passed and President Obama signed into law what we know as the Zadroga Act, which was intended to reopen the VCF and provide compensation for the people who were continuing to feel these health effects. We were reopened in 2011. At that time, they provide $2.775 billion in funding, and we were supposed to be open for 5 years, closing in 2016. In 2015, it became clear that we weren't going to finish, and so they reauthorized us for another 5 years until 2020 and provided additional $4.6 billion in funding. So as of when I came on board in 2016, we had $7.375 total billion in funding, and we were slated to close in December of 2020. It became, by February of 2019, it became clear not only that claims were continuing to come in, that people were continuing to get sick, but also that that amount of money was not going to be enough, even for the claims that we knew we had or that we expected to receive. And so actually in February of 2019, I had to make a very, very hard decision required by the law and decide to slash the awards. We announced at that time that we would be reducing the awards by up to 70% because we didn't have enough funding to compensate all of the claims that we knew we had, and the statute required me to take some action to make sure that we didn't exceed the available funding. Partly as a consequence of that announcement, but also partly as a consequence of just the real fact that there are so many needy claimants, Congress at that time made a concerted effort to renew the statute, and that's the bill that President Trump signed into law in July of 2019, reauthorizing the VCF essentially permanently. Mm-hmm. We're now reauthorized until 2090 and providing as much appropriated funds as may be necessary for all eligible claims.
Wow. With that, I mean, that's a tremendous mission that you're leading. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about your specific responsibilities and duties as the special master of the VCF. And, you mentioned Ken Feinberg. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the term special master.
So when Congress established the VCF in 2001, it created this special master position. Okay. And the intent really was to create someone who could serve as a neutral arbiter. They wanted to take it outside of the government. They wanted to make sure that it was someone who wasn't infected by politics, and have someone serve as a neutral arbiter. And because they vested Congress, when I say they, I mean Congress, vested a tremendous amount of discretion in this person. The way that the statute is set up, it was set up that way back in 2001. It remains so to this day, is that the special master makes the final determinations on these awards, and they're not subject to any sort of judicial review. So the decisions that are being made by the special master are final. We have an administrative internal appeal process. That was true in VCF1 as well. So there is an internal mechanism for reconsideration, but there's no outside review of these awards. And so they really wanted to create this sort of mechanism that was basically the last word. And that's why they used the special master term. It was created as an appointment made by the Attorney General. The Attorney General in 2001 was John Ashcroft, appointed Mr. Feinberg, and he served in that capacity. When the VCF was reopened as VCF2 in 2011, Sheila Birnbaum, who was a very, very accomplished tort litigator, was appointed as the special master. And when she left the program in 2016, that's when I was appointed by Attorney General Lynch.
So what's your day like? I mean, if you think about responsibilities and duties.
The VCF is a very, very big program. Okay, yeah. We operate with about 175 employees and contractors. We have 2 offices, one in D.C. where most of our operations are run, but we also obviously have an office in New York. It is the hub of our appeal process, and it's also the place from which we sort of coordinate all of our interface with the 9/11 community. And so I have 2 deputy special masters that help me out in the day-to-day, one in New York and one in D.C., both of whom run operations in their respective offices. The staff includes attorneys, support personnel, people who process, evaluate, and adjudicate the claims, contractors who are responsible for operations, including a toll-free helpline that we operate, our correspondence and payment processing procedures, as well as our IT, because we do run a pretty substantial website that gets a significant amount of traffic, as well as all of our claims are subject to online filing, and we process the claims online as well. We operate with the support, obviously, with the Department of Justice and specifically with the Civil Division, which provides our operational and sort of back office support. The scale of the operation is really big, and so it's quite a lot to oversee. On average, each month, the VCF helpline receives about 3,000 calls. We send out about 10,000 pieces of correspondence each month to attorneys and to the claimants, and we receive an average about 3,000 pieces of mail each month. We're still getting around 600 claims a month.
That's amazing. It's a lot of work to manage. As VCF Special Master, what are the top 3 challenges that you face in your position, and how are you addressing those challenges today?
So it's a really interesting question, and on one level, it's one that I would have answered very differently just a few months ago. I'll come back to that in a second, but the biggest challenge I have, and it's been the same challenge since I started in this position, is to get claims reviewed and awards out to these claimants in a manner that is timely, fair, and as efficient as possible. It has always been my goal to try to do that from submission to determination in 12 months or less. We were significantly behind that goal when I started in 2016. We've gotten closer to it, but we're not there yet. But we are definitely trying to get there. The one thing that has changed significantly is obviously with the permanent authorization of the VCF, funding is no longer a problem. Mm-hmm. For a very, very long time, for the first 3 years of my tenure, one of my biggest concerns was to make sure that we didn't run out of money, that we had enough money to compensate everyone, at least at some level, who came in the door because they were suffering from an illness as related to their 9/11 exposure. And so we were very, very careful. We did a lot of projections. We did a lot of thinking about how the money was going to be spread out amongst this population, because I wanted to be very sure that every claimant who came in got at least something. Look, it goes without saying that there is no amount of money that can compensate for these sorts of losses. But we're created for that purpose, and we do what we can, and we're hopeful that it provides at least some amount of relief to these claimants. The problem of money no longer exists because we have now been permanently funded and we have been given by Congress a grant of discretion to make as much awards as we think are necessary. But that said, it has raised a new challenge, which is that we received that grant from Congress because we had demonstrated the fiscal responsibility and the responsible stewardship of government funding that was necessary to get that level of confidence. We, of course, need to maintain that as we move forward.
So, Rupa, you mentioned earlier the permanent authorization of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. I'd like for you to talk a little bit more, maybe perhaps elaborate on the core elements of that law, and perhaps how does it differ from the other authorizations, both the original, the 2011, 2015?
For the most part, the law remains unchanged from how it was when we started this process. But there are two very large exceptions that were part of the most recent enactment by Congress. Obviously, the length of time that claims are allowed to be filed and the removal of the funding cap. Prior to passage of the law, the deadline for filing a claim was December 18th, 2020, and a lot of our materials and our website all reflected that date. Now, people can file a claim until October 1st, 2090, which is essentially intended to give everyone who was there, in however old they might have been at the time, an opportunity to file a claim with the fund if they become ill as a result of their presence. And, of course, as we've talked about, while we previously operated with a set amount of appropriated funding that we could not exceed, the new law appropriates such funds as may be necessary to pay all eligible claims.
So I'd like to do a follow-up there. I'd like to get into the mechanics. You mentioned there was an information gap, and it was around eligibility, I think you mentioned earlier, in terms of folks not knowing that this fund existed or that they were eligible to submit a claim. Could you tell us more about who actually is eligible? And how would they go about submitting the claim, and maybe perhaps give us an overview of the claims processing?
So the VCF process has two distinct steps: registration and filing a claim. Registration is simple. It preserves your right to file a claim in the future if you become sick. You can register on the website, which is www.vcf.gov, or over the phone by calling the VCF helpline, 1-855-885-1555. You don't need to be sick, exhibiting symptoms, or have a certification from the World Trade Center Health Program in order to register. We encourage everyone who may have been there to register with the VCF now, even if they're not sick, to avoid missing any of our deadlines. There is no harm in registering, and it does not obligate you to file a claim, and it does not waive any legal rights. The second step is filing a claim. And filing a claim is done once the World Trade Center Health Program, which is our sister program operated out of HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, has certified that you have an eligible 9/11-related illness. Filing a claim requires the completion of a claim form and the submission of a number of relevant documents. As a general rule, we review claims first in, first out, so we review them in the order in which the claim was submitted. And the time frame for processing depends on the type and complexity of the claim, whether the documents needed have been submitted, and a variety of other factors. We review claims in two phases: eligibility and compensation. For eligibility, we're looking at the claim to determine whether the claimant is eligible to receive compensation under the parameters that are laid out in the statute. These include whether or not the claim was timely registered, whether or not the claimant has proven by evidence that they were present at one of the attack sites, which in New York City is all of Manhattan south of Canal Street, or at the Pentagon or at the Shanksville site, and that the claimant, and the criteria continue, the claimant suffers from an eligible physical injury or condition as certified or verified by the World Trade Center Health Program. We do only compensate for physical health conditions. Okay. The World Trade Center Health Program will treat for mental health conditions and certify for mental health conditions, but we are prohibited by law from compensating for mental health conditions. And finally, we a claimant is only eligible to participate in the VCF if they comply with the Act's requirement that any 9/11-related lawsuit be waived, settled, or properly dismissed. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the VCF is an alternative to tort litigation, and so the waiver of the right to litigate is part of the process, and you have to waive the right to file a civil suit arising from your injuries as a result in order to participate in the VCF.
That's very informative. Thank you. After the eligibility review, once a claimant is deemed eligible, would you tell us more about how the claimant is compensated? How's the compensation determined? And, is there a methodology or calculation from VCF1 and VCF2 that you guys use?
For compensation, all awards are individually compensated based on the specific circumstances of the claim. So we do look at each claim individually to determine the appropriate value of the award. The VCF reviews eligible claims to determine two different kinds of compensation. We compensate for what we call non-economic loss, and this is a pain and suffering award, essentially. And in appropriate cases, we will also compensate for economic loss, which is when someone can't work as a result of their physical condition, and therefore we are compensating loss of earnings or employment benefits out into the future because they've been determined to be disabled as a result of their 9/11-related condition. So non-economic loss awards, starting in 2016, because Congress changed the law, are capped by statute at $90,000 for non-cancer conditions and $250,000 for a cancer condition. In order to receive a non-economic loss award, you don't have to do anything other than be eligible. If you meet the eligibility criteria, you registered on time, you were present, you have a certified condition from the health program, you've waived your right to file a lawsuit, you automatically receive a non-economic loss award. Economic loss awards are dependent on a disability determination. So if a government entity like the Social Security Administration or the Workers' Comp Board or a pension entity or a private insurer has determined that the claimant suffers from a full or partial occupational disability as a result of an eligible 9/11-related physical injury or condition, then we'll calculate economic loss. The economic loss calculation is very individualized. It's based on a variety of factors, looking at what the rate of income was, how many years of work life were remaining, how old the claimant is, what sorts of benefits they were receiving from their employer, like health insurance benefits or retirement benefits or pension benefits. In limited cases, we will reimburse for out-of-pocket medical expenses or for burial costs in deceased claims. And we always ask the claimants for additional information as needed. We are required by law to subtract from our calculated awards what we call collateral offsets, which are benefits that are paid to the claimant by other entities because of the eligible 9/11-related condition. So if the claimant is receiving a disability benefit from Social Security or a workers' comp benefit or a pension disability benefit, then those amounts are calculated out into the future and subtracted or offset from our award so that we're not so that the claimant isn't double dipping. These offsets can include disability benefits, survivor benefits and deceased claims, settlements from lawsuits that were filed before the statute was enacted, and in the case of deceased claim, life insurance that's paid to the victim's beneficiaries.
So you provided us, and it was really important, some legislative and processing context. I'd like to explore your strategic vision for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund because of its updated mission, if you will, and funding levels, if you will. What are some of your key priorities going forward?
To be honest, our mission remains very much the same, serving the needs of this incredibly deserving community, getting awards out to them as quickly as possible, making sure that the results that we're creating are fair and justifiable. With the passage of the legislation, we're now in a position to continue to do that for the foreseeable future. We no longer have to worry about closing down shop, about when the last claims are going to come in, et cetera. So right now we're we're taking a deep breath, giving ourselves a little bit of time to think carefully about what kind of changes can continue to improve the process now that it will be in place until 2090, and how best to handle some of the changes that will come with the passage of time. I think one of the things that has concerned many of us, of course, is that as time passes, the ability to prove by evidence that you were present at the site tends to fade. Memories fade, witnesses pass away, employer records are destroyed under ordinary records destruction principles. Medical records no longer exist. And so we're trying to figure out what the best mechanisms are for preserving that sort of evidence and making sure that it's available to us so that we can make legitimate decisions going forward.
Are you looking, with the changing population and the expansion of the fund into 2090 and trying to keep up with potential survivors and find new folks? Are there new relationships that you're looking to build upon, or new ways you're looking to get to the populations?
I think that there are. As time goes on, there are a number of already established sort of 9/11 related advocacy groups, both that were originally created in the wake of 9/11 to deal with victims and survivors, but we're also seeing newer ones come into play. There's a new students group, for example, that's attempting to focus on people who were students at the time of 9/11 who are now suffering health issues, that are working to get information out the door to the people that they can reach. Obviously, social media is unfortunately a relatively new thing for government, even though it's not new for anybody else. But that is something that we're looking into. It is not something that the VCF has done up till this point, and so it is something that we're looking into. But in the meantime, we can get information to these groups and advocates who can provide the information out to their constituencies. We also have growing relationships with both the World Trade Center Health Program's Responder Steering Committee, which includes all of the major organizations, the fire department, the police department, EMS, et cetera, that had personnel at the site, particularly in New York, and the World Trade Center Health Program's Survivor Steering Committee, which includes representatives from many of the boroughs and community boards who have residents in the area. And so through those relationships, we've been able to build upon their efforts to reach their members by providing up-to-date information, streamlined talking points, written materials that they can sort of distribute to try to get more word out into the neighborhoods.
That's great. Before we close, I just want to ask you, are there any other key accomplishments you'd like to highlight? And more importantly, what's coming? What's the future like for the Victim Compensation Fund?
I think that the clearest indication of our success is the permanent authorization. It is very unusual for a federal government program to be authorized with essentially unlimited funding for 90 years. And we feel that that's a testament to the program that we've created and that we've operated for the last 4 or 5 years in a way that does exactly what it's supposed to. The fact that Congress would enter into that sort of authorization with no substantive alteration of the procedures that we use, of the mechanisms that we use to calculate awards, of the discretion that's been awarded to the special master, all of that was left in place. And so I think that clearly reflects that the program is doing exactly what it was supposed to do. That said, permanent authorization creates a new challenge. We have to figure out how this program looks going forward, and we have to take a program that was created to serve a limited term, was then renewed for another limited term, and at each one of those stages, we made decisions about how the process was going to go forward, what sort of technology we were going to use, that were based in the fact that we had limited funds and limited time. Now we no longer face either of those constraints, although of course we have a responsibility to be fiscal and fair. And so we have to figure out how we're going to move this program onto a permanent footing. And that is an effort that is underway. It is something that we're talking about and thinking about on a daily basis. But I think it's going to be a little while longer before we really see where that's going to lead us.
Be sure to join us next time on the Business of Government Hour TV for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government and its effectiveness. Until then, it's businessofgovernment.org.